The words cut through the smoky Chicago air like shattered glass. "You think you can play hero with my father? You piece of trash?" Chief Michael Rodriguez's voice was harsh, unforgiving, filled with a rage that made the other firefighters step back. Jake Chen froze, a warm container of chili still in his hand, the frail old man clinging to his arm like he was the only anchor left in a storm. Jake blinked hard. "Sir, I don't understand." Chief Rodriguez didn't let him finish. His eyes were ice cold, drilling into Jake like he was looking at a criminal. "Step away from him. Now!" Jake lifted both hands, palms out, the container nearly slipping from his grip. "Wait, Chief. I found him 3 days ago outside the old Mercy Hospital. He was confused, didn't know where he was. I just—" Before Jake could finish explaining, Chief Rodriguez's fist connected with his jaw. It wasn't a slap or a shove. It was a full, wild punch that sent Jake stumbling backward, blood trickling from his split lip. The container of chili crashed to the asphalt, spattering across the firehouse floor. "Don't hurt Jake," the old man cried out, his voice shaking. "He brings me soup. He's kind." Gasps erupted from the gathered firefighters. Lieutenant Sarah Walsh stepped forward. "Chief, what the hell?" "Did he just assault a rookie?" whispered Tommy Brennan, pulling out his phone. Rodriguez pointed straight at Jake, his voice rising like a prosecutor's. "This piece of garbage kidnapped my father. He's been hiding him for 3 days. Look at him. He's drugged, confused." "I didn't drug anyone," Jake said, struggling to his feet, tasting blood. "I found him wandering alone. He was scared, hungry. I just tried to help." The sirens arrived within minutes. 3 police cruisers pulled up to Station 19, officers spilling out to surround the scene. The other firefighters stood in shocked silence as Jake was handcuffed, his turnout gear still smelling of smoke from the warehouse fire they'd just returned from. "He assaulted the kid," Lieutenant Walsh called out to the officers. "She kidnapped my father," Rodriguez snapped. "He has dementia. He's been missing for 3 days." The old man looked around in confusion, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Why is Jake crying? He gave me blanket when I was cold." As they led Jake away in handcuffs, he caught sight of Chief Rodriguez watching, blood on his knuckles, jaw tight with satisfaction. The old man, Rodriguez's father, stood there shaking, not understanding why his friend was being taken away. 3 days earlier, Thomas Rodriguez had broken free from his captors. He wasn't sure how it had happened. The door to the basement had been left slightly ajar. The men who'd grabbed him while he was walking to the corner store had stepped away to argue about something, and he'd managed to shuffle out barefoot into the Chicago night. They'd taken him for ransom, demanding money from his successful son. But something had gone wrong with their plan, and in their confusion, Thomas had escaped into the maze of the city's south side. He wandered for hours, dazed and frightened, his Alzheimer's making everything feel like a waking nightmare. The faces of strangers blurred together, the street signs made no sense, and he couldn't remember his own address or even his son's phone number. Thomas Rodriguez had wandered into Jake Chen's world broken, soaked from the evening rain, barely conscious. He'd collapsed on a bench outside the abandoned Mercy Hospital, shivering uncontrollably, whispering the same word over and over. "Michael. Michael." Jake had been walking back from his shift at a different firehouse, covering for a sick colleague. Most people would have crossed the street or pretended not to see the old man. Jake had crouched beside him instead, wrapped him in his jacket, and tried calling 911. When the dispatcher said it would be hours before anyone could respond to a non-emergency homeless situation, Jake had made a different choice. He brought Thomas home to his small apartment, ran him a warm bath, fed him chicken soup with crackers, and let him sleep on the couch with Jake's rescue dog, Smokey, curled up beside him. Jake didn't ask for anything in return. He had no idea the man on his sofa was the father of the most feared fire chief in Chicago. No idea there was a manhunt underway. no idea he was about to become the target of the most powerful man in the Chicago Fire Department. At the police station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake sat on a metal bench in the holding cell, his lips swollen, his cheek bruised purple. Hours bled into days. No visitors, no phone calls answered. The media picked up the story fast. Rookie firefighter accused of kidnapping fire chief's father. The headlines were brutal. Hero or criminal? The dark side of Jake Chen. He lost his position at the firehouse. His landlord started the eviction process. His neighbors avoided eye contact when he was finally released on bail. 4 days later, the metal door of Jake's apartment building creaked open. A woman in a sleek black suit stood there holding a manila envelope. "Name's Detective Maria Santos," she said. "Your friend Luis from the neighborhood watch called me. Said you helped his mother during that apartment fire last year." Jake nodded, barely believing anyone still remembered his good deeds. "I pulled security footage from 3 cameras along Roosevelt Road," Santos continued. "Want to guess what it shows?" That afternoon, in a conference room at City Hall, Detective Santos played the footage for an audience that included Chief Rodriguez, his legal team, and 2 investigative reporters. On the screen, Thomas Rodriguez was clearly visible shivering on a bench under a flickering streetlight. Jake approached slowly, offering him hot soup from a thermos and his own jacket. No coercion, no manipulation, just simple human kindness. Rodriguez's mouth parted slightly, his face draining of color. He said nothing. "You assaulted him," Santos said, arms folded. "Called him trash, destroyed his career. And what had he done? He kept your father alive." The reporters took notes furiously. "I didn't know," Rodriguez struggled to say. "I thought—" "He told you exactly what happened," Santos snapped. "You just didn't listen." Later that day, Jake was released from all charges. Rodriguez waited outside the courthouse, his dress uniform perfectly pressed, a certified check in his hand. "I want to offer compensation," he said, avoiding Jake's eyes. "For what I said, for the harm I caused, I was wrong." Jake looked at the check. 6 figures. He looked back at Rodriguez, his lips still scabbed, his pride intact. "No," he said simply. Rodriguez's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "No? I didn't help your father for money," Jake said, "and I don't want your guilt check." Rodriguez blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "I want to make this right." Jake looked him dead in the eyes. "You don't fix something like this with money. You fix it by learning to look past your assumptions and seeing people for who they are, not who you expect them to be." Rodriguez opened his mouth but found no words. Jake turned and walked away, shoulders high, dignity intact. 2 days earlier, rain had battered the cracked sidewalks of Chicago's South Side like a relentless war drum. The city had gone quiet in that way it only did when the sky turned dark gray and the wind warned people to stay indoors. But Jake Chen wasn't indoors. He was walking home from his second job at the community center, backpack heavy with leftover sandwiches from the evening program, rain soaking through his jacket. It had been a long week of double shifts. His rookie firefighter salary barely covered rent, so he picked up hours wherever he could. His feet ached, his stomach growled, but he'd learned to push through the exhaustion. The son of immigrants, he'd been taught that hard work was the only currency that mattered. He rounded the corner near the old hospital when he saw him, an elderly man sitting on a bench with no shoes, his socks soaked and torn, toes poking through holes. The man clutched a threadbare blanket around himself like armor, his eyes glassy and vacant. He rocked slightly, whispering something over and over under his breath. "Michael, Michael, Michael." Jake slowed, instinct prickling. Most people would have walked past. Hell, he probably should have. He had laundry to do, bills to pay, and an early shift at the firehouse tomorrow. But something about the man's posture, the way he trembled like he was disappearing into himself, stopped Jake in his tracks. He stepped closer. "Sir, are you okay?" The man didn't look up, just kept rocking and whispering his son's name. Jake crouched down in front of him, his knees wet against the pavement. "Do you know where you are?" "Michael," the man's voice cracked, no louder than a breath. "Looking for Michael, my boy." Jake's heart clenched. The man didn't just seem lost. He seemed completely adrift, like someone had opened a door in his mind, and everything that made him who he was had just walked out. "You're freezing," Jake murmured. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." The man flinched when Jake touched his arm gently. "It's okay," Jake reassured him. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Jake. I live just a few blocks from here. I've got soup and heat. You'll be safe." The old man stared at Jake like he was the first person who had spoken to him in years. Slowly, painfully, he let Jake help him to his feet. Back at his tiny one-bedroom apartment, Jake gave the man a towel, a fresh pair of sweatpants that had belonged to his father, and a bowl of chicken soup from a can. The stranger devoured it like he hadn't eaten in days. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently. The man paused, the spoon halfway to his lips. I don't remember." "That's okay," Jake said softly. "We'll figure it out." Jake called him Mr. T, short for Thomas. Though he didn't know that yet, it just felt right. He let the man sleep on his couch, placed his rescue dog Smokey nearby for comfort, and kept a light on in the hallway. That first night, Mr. T talked in his sleep, flinching at imaginary sounds. Jake sat nearby, watching over him like a silent guardian. The next morning, Jake made scrambled eggs and toast. Mr. T stared at the plate like it was treasure. He spoke a little more. Random thoughts, half-formed memories. The firehouse. Red trucks. Michael hated the sirens when he was small. None of it made complete sense, but Jake nodded anyway. He posted a vague description on a local missing person forum, but didn't include a photo. The man was too frightened for that. Jake figured maybe someone in the community would recognize the description, or maybe the man would remember something himself. The news was playing quietly on Jake's small television when it happened. Thomas Rodriguez, father of Chicago Fire Chief Michael Rodriguez, was reportedly abducted 4 nights ago. The kidnappers demanded a $2 million ransom. Authorities fear the worst, as no contact has been made in over 48 hours. Jake turned, coffee mug in hand, and looked at the screen. The photo that flashed across the broadcast nearly made him drop the cup. It was him. Same eyes, same gentle posture, just in a dress shirt and tie instead of Jake's borrowed sweatpants. Jake stared at the screen, his mind reeling. The man sleeping on his couch was the father of Chief Rodriguez, the most intimidating figure in the Chicago Fire Department. The same chief who had a reputation for being ruthless, demanding, and completely intolerant of weakness. That night, Jake debated going to the police. But something deep inside him said to wait. Something about the way Mr. T trembled when phones rang, or how he hid behind Jake when strangers knocked at the door, made Jake's stomach twist. The man wasn't just lost, he was terrified of something. Then came the confrontation. Jake had just returned from his shift at Station 47 when the black SUVs rolled up. Men in suits, police cars, cameras, and Chief Rodriguez himself, looking like he was ready to declare war. Jake didn't even have time to explain before he was bleeding on the firehouse floor. Now, sitting in a holding cell with a split lip and a silence thick as smoke, Jake stared at the ceiling and wondered how trying to help someone had turned him into a criminal. His friend and fellow rookie, Elena Martinez, managed to visit during visiting hours. She slipped him a note through the bars. "They dropped all charges," she whispered. "The security footage proved everything. You're being released in an hour." "Because of the video?" Jake asked. Elena nodded. Store cameras, hospital surveillance, even someone's dash cam. It proves you weren't anywhere near him when he was kidnapped. He must have escaped and wandered until he found you. Jake let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Elena continued. They arrested the real kidnappers this morning. 3 guys who worked security for some private company. They had him in a basement on the west side. When the ransom drop went wrong, they panicked and left the door unlocked. That's when he ran. Jake shook his head slowly. So I just happened to find him. You were the only one who stopped to help, Elena said. Everyone else just walked by. Jake was released that afternoon. Chief Rodriguez waited outside the station house, but Jake walked past him without a word. He had nothing to say to the man who had destroyed his life over an assumption. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Jake's tiny kitchen like forgiveness that hadn't quite arrived yet. Thomas Rodriguez, he'd remembered his name after seeing himself on the news, sat at Jake's small table, wrapped in a blanket, sipping chamomile tea from a chipped mug. Sleep okay? Jake asked, gently, pouring himself coffee. Thomas nodded, though his eyes were still distant. I dreamed about the firehouse, he murmured. Red trucks. Michael was so small when I first took him there, he wanted to slide down the pole. Jake smiled softly. Sounds like good memories. He used to love the sirens, Thomas continued. Would make the noise all day long, drove his mother crazy. His face clouded. Where is she now? Your wife? Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Cancer. 5 years ago. I wore the wrong tie to her funeral. Black instead of navy. She would have laughed. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 souls connected by unexpected kindness. Then Thomas looked at Jake with clearer eyes than he'd had in days. Am I in trouble? He asked. Jake shook his head. No, Mr. Rodriguez. You're safe now. The people who hurt you have been arrested. Thomas frowned, processing this slowly. Why would anyone want to hurt an old man? Jake's throat tightened. Sometimes people think money is worth more than human life. Thomas considered this for a long time, then sighed. That's wrong. Yes, Jake agreed. It is. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake opened it to find a woman in her mid-50s with a leather notebook, professional but warm, standing beside Elena. This is Dr. Patricia Williams, Elena explained. Memory specialist. Chief Rodriguez asked her to come evaluate your guest. No pressure. Jake hesitated, but Dr. Williams stepped forward with a kind smile. I'm only here to talk if Mr. Rodriguez is comfortable. Thomas looked up at her with the strange recognition of someone who couldn't quite place a familiar face. Do I know you? No, she said kindly, kneeling beside him, but I'd like to get to know you. The session lasted an hour. Jake sat nearby, quiet, listening as the doctor gently probed Thomas's memory. They learned his birthday, the name of his childhood dog, that he'd been a firefighter for 32 years before retiring. That he'd taught Michael everything about the job, from tying knots to reading smoke patterns. He was so proud the day Michael became chief, Thomas said, his voice strengthening with the memory. Youngest in department history. But I worried he was too hard on people, too much like me when I was angry. Dr. Williams scribbled notes. That's a significant insight, Mr. Rodriguez. After the doctor left, Jake walked her to the door. Is he getting better? Dr. Williams smiled gently. Memory is like a river with dementia. Sometimes it flows clearly, sometimes it's muddy. But he remembers love. He remembers kindness. That's something. That afternoon, Jake received a formal letter delivered by courier. Mr. Chen, I owe you more than I can ever repay. I have spent most of my career believing that strength meant never showing weakness, that leadership meant never admitting mistakes. What happened with my father was a failure of everything I thought I understood about being a man, a son, and a chief. I failed him, and I failed you. I know you don't want my money, but I'm offering something else. The Chicago Fire Department is launching a new community outreach program, support for at-risk populations, homeless services, and community safety education. I want you to help lead it. Not because of guilt, but because you saw what everyone else missed, a human being in need. You saved my father. In doing so, you reminded me what it means to serve. Please consider this opportunity. Chief Michael Rodriguez. Jake read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it on his kitchen counter. He wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't ready to forget. But maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all this pain. The next day, Jake took Thomas for a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, and spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the small yards along their route. They walked slowly, Jake's arm ready to steady the older man if needed. Children played on the sidewalk nearby. A vendor sold hot dogs from a corner cart. Someone called out, "Hey, Jake! Good to see you, man!" Jake smiled and waved back. People were starting to see him as more than just the guy from the headlines. Thomas stopped in front of a small firehouse, Station 12, watching the firefighters washing one of the trucks. "I worked there," he said suddenly, pointing with a shaky finger. 30 years. Captain Rodriguez." "You want to go in?" Jake asked. Thomas shook his head, but his eyes were bright with memory. Just wanted to see it again. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the familiar rhythm of firehouse life. After a while, Thomas asked, "Do you think Michael remembers the good times?" "I think he remembers more than he shows," Jake offered. "Sometimes anger is just fear wearing a disguise." Thomas looked up at Jake. "You're wise for someone so young." Jake smiled. "My grandmother always said that pain either makes you bitter or makes you better. It's your choice which one." She sounds like she was smart. She was. She also said that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what someone did to you. It's about not letting what they did define who you become. They began walking again, slow and steady. Behind them, watching from across the street, stood Chief Rodriguez in civilian clothes, jeans and a Chicago Fire Department t-shirt. He didn't approach, just watched his father walking with the young man who had saved his life. His eyes were wet with unshed tears, and there was a question in his expression that he hadn't yet figured out how to ask. Later that evening, Jake sat on his small balcony overlooking the busy street below. Elena arrived with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "You read his letter?" she asked. "Yeah." "You going to take the job?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the traffic below, the people hurrying home from work, the kids playing basketball in the court across the street. "I'm not here to fix broken chiefs," Jake said finally. "But maybe I can help build something that prevents more people from falling through the cracks." Elena nodded slowly. "That's one hell of a reason to say yes." Jake looked down at his hands, still bearing small scars from various rescues, calloused from years of hard work. Then he looked at the sky, thinking about the old man with no shoes sitting alone on a bench, and how all it had taken to change everything was a thermos of soup and someone who cared enough to stop. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the beginning of everything. The invitation came on a Tuesday, printed on official Chicago Fire Department letterhead, delivered in a discreet white envelope. Chicago Fire Department Community Initiative launch. Private presentation for stakeholders and founding members. At the bottom, Jake's name was printed in bold letters, as if he had always belonged there. He stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or tear it up. Elena sat on his couch, legs crossed, sipping iced tea. "You said you wanted to make a difference. There's your chance." "It's his chance to look good," Jake muttered. "Pull out a chair so he can seem generous." "Maybe," Elena shrugged. "But maybe he's finally realized the room was empty without people like you." Jake didn't reply. Instead, he folded the invitation and slid it into his notebook, saying nothing more. 3 days later, he stood in front of the Chicago Fire Department headquarters downtown. The building was imposing, all brick and tradition and authority, the kind of place that looked like it cost more per hour to maintain than Jake's entire neighborhood earned in a week. A security guard waved him through with a nod. A staff member in a crisp uniform escorted him to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Inside were 8 people seated around a mahogany table. Chief Rodriguez stood at the head, hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid as always. When Jake walked in, everyone turned. Rodriguez didn't smile, didn't nod, just gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." Jake sat slowly, his spine straight, eyes forward. He felt every gaze on him like spotlights. The woman to his right, Dr. Sandra Kim, founder of a community health clinic, offered a small smile. "Been wanting to meet you. Word travels fast in our circles." Another man, clearly a former city councilman, leaned in. "You're the reason this initiative exists, son." Jake gave a polite nod, unsure whether that was praise or burden. Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Let's begin." What followed was an hour of real discussion about real issues. Fire safety in low-income housing, emergency response in underserved communities, the gap between fire department services and community needs. It was more than PR charity. It was actual groundwork, strategy, planning. But every time Jake spoke, suggesting mobile safety education units, proposing partnerships with community organizations, challenging a proposal that ignored undocumented residents, Rodriguez listened. Not like a chief waiting to correct a subordinate, but like a student learning from someone who understood the streets in ways the department never could. Afterward, as the others filtered out, Rodriguez approached Jake with a tablet in hand. "These are preliminary grant applications," he said. "The team wants your input on distribution priorities." Jake took the tablet but didn't look up. "Why me?" Rodriguez hesitated. "Because you care. And because you already do the work. We're just trying to catch up." Jake finally met his eyes. "You're not trying to fix me anymore?" "No," Rodriguez said quietly. "I'm trying to fix myself." Jake gave a slow nod. "Good. Start by calling your father more often." That evening, Jake returned home to find Thomas sitting on his small balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset with Smokey curled up beside him. "Long day?" Thomas asked, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "You could say that." Jake sank into the chair beside him. "You still angry at Michael?" Jake considered the question. "I'm working on it." Thomas chuckled softly. "He always needed to learn things the hard way. Even as a boy. Stubborn like his mother." "He's trying," Jake admitted. "Building something real. Not just for the cameras." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "He's got a lot to prove. To himself, mostly." "Then he's lucky he has time to figure it out." Thomas looked at Jake with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in months. "You gave me more in 3 days than some people get in a lifetime. You saw me when I couldn't see myself." Jake felt his throat tighten. "Thank you for trusting me." "Thank you," Thomas added quietly, "for the soup and the safety." Later that night, Jake pulled out the tablet and began reviewing the grant applications. Names, organizations, proposals, dozens of stories about underfunded community centers, overworked social workers, high school kids running food drives from their garages. He saw himself in those applications. He saw Thomas. He saw his own immigrant parents who had worked 3 jobs each just to give him a chance. By morning, he had notes on all of them. Weeks passed. The initiative launched under the name Bridge Program, chosen by Jake. "A bridge doesn't eliminate the gap," he'd explained at the press conference. "It just helps you cross safely." Funding poured in. Community partnerships flourished. Jake found himself interviewed on local radio shows, speaking at community meetings, and occasionally even consulted by city officials. not as a victim of false accusations, but as a voice with credibility and vision. But with every success, he kept his feet planted firmly on the ground. He still volunteered at the community center on weekends, still helped at the local food bank, still took Thomas for walks every Sunday past Station 12, where the old man would wave to the firefighters and they would wave back. One day, as they passed a new mural that had gone up, an image of a firefighter sharing a meal with an elderly man, Thomas stopped. "Is that us?" he asked. Jake nodded. Artist heard the story. Wanted to paint something about kindness. Thomas studied the painted version of himself, frail and lost, and then looked at Jake, calm and caring. "I don't remember that moment very clearly," he admitted. "That's okay," Jake said. "I remember it for both of us." Thomas squeezed Jake's hand. Some things are worth remembering forever. One Sunday afternoon, Chief Rodriguez came to visit. He brought no entourage, no cameras, just himself in civilian clothes holding a single photograph. He found Jake and Thomas on the balcony sharing iced tea. "I thought you might want this," he said, handing the photo to his father. It was from 20 years ago. Michael, at age 10, wearing a too big firefighter helmet, grinning as Thomas held him up to ring the station bell. Thomas stared at it for a long time. "That was the day you said you wanted to be chief someday," he said, voice caught between wonder and memory. Michael laughed, the sound softer than Jake had ever heard from him. "You told me I had to learn to see people first, trucks second." "Did I say that?" Thomas asked, genuinely surprised by his own wisdom. "Every day for 20 years. They shared a quiet moment, years of complicated history settling into something simpler. Love between a father and son. Michael turned to Jake. "I'm still not sure how to thank you properly." "You don't need to," Jake replied. "But if you want to, keep listening. Keep building. Keep choosing the harder right over the easier wrong." Michael nodded slowly. "I will." Jake rose from his chair. "Good. Now help your dad inside. It's getting chilly." As the two Rodriguez men walked into the apartment, Jake remained on the balcony, watching the city spread out below him. The world hadn't changed overnight. Poverty hadn't vanished. Homelessness hadn't been solved. But something had shifted. A conversation had begun. A bridge had been built. The Chicago Fire Department Community Awards ceremony was not the kind of event Jake had ever pictured himself attending. Held at the historic Palmer House Hotel downtown, it was an evening of dress uniforms, polished brass, and white-gloved service that whispered tradition in every detail. Jake stood near a pillar in the grand ballroom, wearing his dress uniform, the first time he'd put it on since the incident. He felt both proud and out of place among the department brass, city officials, and philanthropists whose donations could fund entire firehouses. Across the room, Chief Rodriguez spotted him and made his way over, nodding politely as he passed other guests. "You clean up well, Chen," he said, offering Jake a glass of water. Jake took it, raising an eyebrow. "Still worried I might say something embarrassing?" Rodriguez actually smiled. A real smile, not the forced politician version Jake had seen before. "Actually, I'm worried you might not say enough." There was a pause between them, comfortable now instead of tense. "This whole night is about community partnership," Rodriguez continued, "about bridging gaps. You're the reason we understand what that actually means." "No," Jake replied. "I'm just the guy who stopped walking." Before Rodriguez could respond, a voice cut through the polite conversation around them, low, cold, entitled. "Well, if it isn't our celebrated do-gooder." They turned to see Commissioner Patricia Hayes approaching, wine glass in hand, political smile sharp as a blade. Hayes was known throughout the city for her tough-love approach to social issues, which was code for believing poor people should simply stop being poor. Jake didn't flinch. "Commissioner Hayes." Hayes gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I understand your little community project is making waves. Food trucks and safety classes for the homeless. Very touching." Rodriguez stiffened, but Jake remained calm. "Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes," Jake said, his tone even. Hayes laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "How wonderfully naive." She turned to Rodriguez. "We should discuss integrating these programs into existing city services. Give them real structure and oversight." Jake set his glass down carefully. "If by oversight you mean bureaucratic control that removes community input, then no thank you." Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Actually, Commissioner, Jake leads the bridge program. Any integration proposals go through him." Hayes's smile cracked for just a moment. "How democratic of you, Chief." She walked away, leaving the scent of political ambition trailing behind her like expensive perfume. Jake exhaled slowly. "Was that supposed to intimidate me?" Rodriguez almost laughed. "She intimidates everyone, except apparently you." "I've faced burning buildings and angry chiefs," Jake said with a slight grin. "Politicians are just smoke without the heat." Rodriguez did laugh then, surprising himself. But Jake's expression turned serious. "Chief, you can't let people like her reshape what we're building. Not for political points or easier funding." "I know," Rodriguez said. "I won't." Jake studied him. "Good. Because this isn't about careers or credit. It's about community." Later that evening, Thomas Rodriguez arrived with Elena Martinez as his escort. The room seemed to soften as soon as he entered, dressed in a neat gray suit, walking with more confidence than he'd shown in months. He no longer looked like a man lost in his own mind. He looked like someone who had found his way back to himself. The crowd applauded as he took a seat at the head table next to Jake and his son. When the microphone was passed to him, Thomas stood with surprising strength. "I don't remember everything," he began, his voice steady. "But I remember him." He looked at Jake. "He saw me when I couldn't see myself. Not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, as a person worth saving." A quiet hush fell over the ballroom. "We talk a lot in our uniforms and ceremonies about service," Thomas continued. "But sometimes the greatest service is sitting beside someone without asking them to prove they deserve it." The applause was thunderous, sustained, emotional. After the ceremony, Jake stepped outside for air. The Chicago night hummed around him, the distant sound of sirens, music from a jazz club down the street, the smell of food trucks serving late-night workers. Elena joined him, loosening her dress uniform collar. "That speech?" she whistled low. "Your friend Thomas just made half the room cry." Jake chuckled. "He's been reading poetry lately. Says it helps him remember feelings even when he forgets facts." Elena leaned against the stone steps. "You know, people are saying you should run for city council." "I don't do politics," Jake said firmly. "Sure you do. You just do it with actions instead of words, with presence instead of promises." Jake smiled, then looked up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. "I don't want power, Elena. I want presence, real presence. People who show up in the hard moments and stay for the long work." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You think the city's ready for that kind of leadership?" "I think the city's starving for it." That night, Jake returned home to find a note slipped under his door. No signature, just a line written in firm handwriting. "The world changes when ordinary people choose to see each other. You saw me. That changed everything. Thank you. TR." Jake read it twice, then tucked it into his journal next to a photo from the Community Awards ceremony. Across town, in the chief's office overlooking the main firehouse, Michael Rodriguez stood at his window looking out at the city lights. On his desk sat blueprints, not for new fire trucks or equipment, but for a community safety center, part education hub, part emergency shelter, part sanctuary for anyone who needed help. At the top of the plans, one name stood in bold letters: Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Jake, it's Chief Rodriguez. I want you to design this from the ground up. No committee interference, no political oversight. Your vision, your call." And for the first time in a very long time, Michael Rodriguez smiled, not the smile of a man who had won something, but the smile of a man who had finally started to understand what really mattered. Because dignity, like courage, could never be given. It could only be recognized, respected, and returned. Jake sat at the long wooden table in his apartment, blueprints and community surveys spread out before him like pieces of hope waiting to be assembled. He was in his off-duty clothes, jeans and a Chicago Fire Department t-shirt, his hair still damp from a shower after his shift. Jazz played softly from his small speaker, and the scent of his grandmother's recipe for beef stew drifted from the kitchen. The Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center. It was no longer just a name on paper, it was becoming real, and it was his to shape. Across from him sat Marcus Williams, a community architect in his late 40s with graying temples and reading glasses perched on his nose. "You're thinking too small," he said, gesturing at one of Jake's sketches. "You've got a once-in-a-generation chance to build something that truly serves." "I'm thinking practical," Jake countered. "If the heating system fails in 2 years, nobody will care how inspiring the design was." Marcus chuckled. "That's what I like about you, Jake. You want beauty with backbone." Jake smiled slightly. "I want function that feels like home." Thomas walked in slowly, moving more steadily than he had in months, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You two have been debating for 3 hours," he observed. "That means it's going well." Marcus accepted a mug gratefully. "Thanks, Mr. Rodriguez." Thomas sat beside Jake, studying a sketch of the main courtyard. "You're keeping the community garden?" "Yeah," Jake said. "Raised beds for vegetables, herbs, flowers, food grown by the community for the community." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Good. My Maria used to say, you want to heal a neighborhood? Feed it with something that grows from its own soil." Jake paused, pen hovering over his notes. "That's going on the wall." The next morning brought troubling news. Jake received a call from one of their community partners in Little Village. There had been vandalism at one of the bridge program's mobile safety units, spray-painted slurs, slashed tires, and a threatening note left on the windshield. Jake was at the scene within 20 minutes. The sight made his chest tight with familiar anger. The mobile unit's colorful safety education graphics had been defaced with red paint. Words too vile to repeat dripped down over images of children learning about fire safety. Inside the unit, Rosa Gutierrez, one of their community educators, sat with an ice pack pressed to her swollen cheek. Her eyes were red but burning with determination. "I told them we wouldn't be intimidated," Rosa said. "They didn't like that answer." "You did right," Jake replied, "but now we respond louder than they attacked." They called in volunteers that same afternoon. By evening, 50 people stood around the damaged unit. Students, parents, retirees, local business owners. Jake stood on a ladder with a paint roller, covering the hate one stroke at a time. Chief Rodriguez arrived late, having changed out of his dress uniform into work clothes. Paint covered his hands by the end of the night. He worked beside Jake in silence, and for once there were no cameras, no speeches, no politics. Just people doing the work that needed to be done. A few days later, Jake was called to a meeting at City Hall. He'd been invited to represent the bridge program in discussions about expanding citywide. It wasn't the kind of place he usually felt comfortable, but Elena urged him to go. Inside the council chamber, politicians in expensive suits sat behind curved desks, papers rustling, voices clipped with the practiced efficiency of people who talked about problems more than they solved them. Jake wore his dress uniform, looking calm but alert. Chief Rodriguez was seated beside him, quiet but supportive. Councilwoman Margaret Foster, known for her fiscal responsibility stance, cleared her throat. "Mr. Chen, we appreciate your efforts, but there's concern about the cost and oversight of community-run operations." Jake met her gaze steadily. "With respect, Councilwoman, the real concern should be the cost of not acting, the cost of letting people fall through cracks we could easily fill." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. "You believe the bridge program can maintain safety standards and financial accountability without direct city oversight?" Foster pressed. "I believe our results speak louder than your skepticism," Jake replied calmly. "We've reduced emergency calls in target neighborhoods by 35% in 8 months. We've connected over 400 families to essential services. And we've done it without criminalizing poverty or homelessness." Before Foster could respond, Thomas Rodriguez stood in the gallery. He was dressed in a neat brown suit, holding a folder, and spoke with the clear authority of his decades in public service. "I worked in this city for 40 years, he said. "Captain, battalion chief, training officer. I've seen programs that look good on paper but fail in practice, and I've seen simple ideas that transform communities." He paused. "My son and Mr. Chen aren't building something perfect. They're building something necessary. Don't let politics kill what works." The room fell silent. Councilwoman Foster nodded slowly, clearly moved despite herself. That evening, Jake and Thomas returned to the apartment. Jake made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, simple, warming comfort food that had become their Sunday tradition. Thomas sat at the small table, studying his bowl thoughtfully. "You're building something important," he said. "So are you," Jake replied. "Every time you speak up, you give other people permission to be honest." Thomas looked up. "Do you think Michael's ready to carry what you're building forward?" Jake considered this carefully. "I think he's still learning how to listen, but that's more than most leaders ever try to do." Thomas smiled. "Then maybe there's hope." "For what?" "For both of us. Learning that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing when to accept it." Later that week, Jake sat in his apartment, reviewing the final blueprints for the Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center. His name was on every page, his heart was in every room, but the next phase wasn't just about buildings, it was about systems, policies, training, legacy. He picked up his phone and called Chief Rodriguez. "I'm ready," Jake said. "For what?" Rodriguez asked. "To talk about making this permanent, building something that lasts beyond any one person or administration." There was silence on the line. Then softly, "I was hoping you'd say that." Jake smiled because he knew the real work was just beginning. Opposition didn't disappear with applause. Bureaucracy didn't vanish with good intentions. But now Jake had something more powerful than anger or ambition. He had a community, a vision, and the steady knowledge that change happened one person, one choice, one moment of courage at a time. The sky over Chicago was low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Jake stood outside the construction site of the Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center, his breath visible in the cold air. The framework was taking shape, steel beams reaching skyward, concrete foundations solid beneath. Each day of progress felt like a small victory, but Jake had learned that victories often came with a price. Behind him, the sounds of construction mingled with laughter from a group of local volunteers who came by after school and worked to help however they could. These were his people, working families, retirees, teens choosing community service over video games. Nobody wore suits or name tags. Everyone showed up by choice. But peace, Jake had discovered, was often temporary. Elena arrived that afternoon with a tense expression and a folded copy of the Chicago Tribune. "You need to see this," she said, handing him the paper. The headline made Jake's stomach drop. Questions raised about bridge program funding. Financial irregularities under investigation. The article was filled with vague allegations, missing documentation, inflated expense reports, and anonymous sources questioning the program's financial management. Nothing concrete, but enough to plant seeds of doubt just as the City Council was preparing to vote on permanent funding. Elena pointed to the byline. Patricia Hayes. She fed this story to her media contacts. Jake exhaled slowly. She couldn't beat us in committee, so now she's playing dirty. That or someone on the inside is leaking information, Elena said quietly. We need to find the source fast. By that evening, Jake, Chief Rodriguez, and Elena were huddled in a small office at the main firehouse. The room was crowded with files, a whiteboard covered in timelines, and a small television showing evening news segments already speculating about the bridge program's integrity. Rodriguez paced the room, clearly agitated. The City Council vote is in 2 weeks. If they freeze funding based on these accusations, we lose half our programs and the safety center construction stops. Jake remained calm, focused. We fight back with transparency. We show receipts. We show results. We show the real people whose lives have changed. Elena opened her laptop. I'll start pulling community testimonials and impact data. We need numbers, but the human stories will carry this. Rodriguez nodded. And I'll get our legal team on the documentation trail. I won't let Hayes destroy this with smoke and mirrors. Jake looked between them. Then we go public. No press releases, no spin. I'll hold a community forum. Let people ask me questions face to face. Rodriguez hesitated. You sure? It could get messy. Jake's voice was steady. So did my life when I decided to help your father. I'll be fine. The community forum was scheduled for the following Saturday at Washington High School's auditorium. No cameras inside, no politicians, no filters, just folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, and open doors for anyone who wanted to come. Jake stood in front of over 200 residents, single mothers, veterans, bus drivers, nurses, students. Some looked curious, others concerned. A few appeared genuinely disappointed by the accusations they'd read. He didn't use a microphone. His voice carried naturally. You've seen the headlines, he began. You've heard the whispers. You deserve to hear the truth from me directly, not filtered through people who've never walked these streets or sat in these chairs. He paused, looking out at faces he recognized from community events, from emergency calls, from late-night conversations at the local diner. There's no missing money. There's no scandal. There's only fear. Fear from people who never thought someone like me, a rookie firefighter, son of immigrants, product of this community, could build something that actually works. A murmur of support rippled through the crowd. I'm not a politician, Jake continued. I'm your neighbor. I've responded to calls in your buildings. I've taught your kids about fire safety. And I'll keep doing it whether they print my name in gold or drag it through mud. A man in the back raised his hand. Is it true they're investigating your expenses? Jake didn't dodge. They're reviewing our books, yes, but every penny is accounted for, every receipt is filed, every program expenditure is documented. When you're trying to change systems, they examine you with a microscope. We expected that. A young woman holding a baby spoke up. You helped my grandmother after that kitchen fire last year. That article didn't mention that. Applause broke out. Then more voices, dozens of personal accounts, each one a thread in the community fabric Jake had helped weave, story by story, crisis by crisis. By the end of the evening, a long line of people waited just to shake his hand, to thank him, to assure him of their support. But not everyone was convinced. The following week, a video surfaced on social media. Grainy security footage from a storage facility used by the bridge program showing what appeared to be Jake and another person removing boxes at night. The caption screamed, "What are they hiding? Bridge program scandal grows." Jake's phone rang constantly. Reporters, concerned donors. Even Rodriguez sounded shaken until Elena called with news. "I found the original footage," she said, storming into Jake's apartment with her laptop. "Watch this." She played the unedited version. It clearly showed Jake and Rosa loading donated winter coats into temporary storage during their annual cold weather drive. The timestamp read December, right in the middle of their most successful community outreach month. Elena was furious. They edited the footage, altered the timestamp, and blurred the donation labels on the boxes. Jake rubbed his temples. "They're not just afraid of what we built. They're afraid of what we represent." Rodriguez called within minutes. "We go live with the real footage, full context, timeline, documentation. I'll use every platform we have." Within days, the backlash turned. Major outlets picked up the real story, complete with unedited footage and testimony from community members. Support surged online. Stand with Jake trended citywide. Donations poured in not just from Chicago, but from firefighters across the country who had heard the story. Former program beneficiaries posted videos. Community educators shared behind-the-scenes footage of their work. Jake became the face not just of resistance, but of quiet, unshakable integrity. And then came the unexpected news. Commissioner Hayes announced her resignation, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities in the private sector. Insiders whispered about pressure from donors who refused to be associated with someone who attacked community heroes for political sport. The following weekend, Jake walked alone through the nearly completed Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center. Sunlight streamed through large windows into what would soon be the community kitchen. On the wall, painted in elegant script, were Thomas's words. "You want to heal a neighborhood? Feed it with something that grows from its own soil." He stood quietly, running his fingers over the fresh paint. Behind him, footsteps echoed. Chief Rodriguez appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the food truck parked outside. "They're calling it a comeback story," Rodriguez said, offering Jake a cup. Jake shook his head slightly. "This wasn't a comeback. This was a reminder." "Of what?" "That truth doesn't need to shout," Jake said. "It just needs to stand." And in that moment, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and possibility, Jake didn't feel tired or angry or defensive. He felt ready. Because storms always passed, but the people who remained standing afterward, they were the ones who built the new world, one act of courage at a time. Jake sat alone in his apartment past midnight, the sounds of the city humming outside his window. The scandal had passed, the accusations had crumbled under the weight of truth, but something still nagged at him. Someone had gone to great lengths to undermine the bridge program, fabricated evidence, manipulated media, planted doubt. That kind of coordinated attack didn't come from petty politics alone. He pulled up files on his laptop, reviewing vendor contracts, expense reports, volunteer applications. Everything had been audited and cleared, but his instincts told him to look deeper. He paused at a logistics invoice from 4 months earlier, a payment to a security consulting firm he'd never heard of. Sentinel Solutions. The paperwork looked official, proper formatting, reasonable amounts, but Jake had never authorized private security services. He called Elena despite the late hour. She answered on the second ring. "Something's not right," he said. "I'm looking at an invoice for services we never requested." By morning, Elena and Chief Rodriguez were sitting in Jake's living room, coffee growing cold as they stared at the laptop screen. "You're right," Elena said, typing rapidly. "Sentinel Solutions has no legitimate business address. It's a shell company registered to a P.O. box in Delaware." She paused, frowning at her screen. "And get this, the same address appears in a network of fake vendors tied to Patricia Hayes' Political Action Committee." Rodriguez leaned forward. "You think Hayes planted fake invoices in our system?" "Worse," Elena said. "I think someone's been inside our operation from the beginning." Someone with access to our financial systems, our schedules, our plans. Jake's jaw tightened. We've been infiltrated. The discovery changed everything. Over the next week, they quietly investigated with the help of Rodriguez's contacts in the department's Internal Affairs Division. The trail led to David Park, a volunteer accountant who had offered his services 6 months earlier, claiming he wanted to give back to the community. Park had been subtly altering records, creating false invoices, and feeding information to Hayes's team. He'd probably expected the fake documentation to be discovered during a routine audit, creating exactly the kind of scandal that had almost destroyed them. Rodriguez was furious when they confronted Park in a recorded session. "You betrayed everything we were trying to build," he said. Park, faced with evidence he couldn't deny, finally broke down. "Hayes promised me a job with the city if I helped her shut you down. She said the program was taking resources away from real city services." Jake felt a familiar anger rising, but he kept his voice level. "And you thought sabotaging help for families was worth a promotion?" Park couldn't meet his eyes. "I didn't think it would go this far. I thought she was right about the program being inefficient." "Inefficient?" Elena snapped. "We've helped more people with our budget than most city departments help with 10 times the funding." But Jake was already thinking ahead. It doesn't matter what he thought. What matters is what we do now. They turned the evidence over to both internal affairs and federal investigators. Hayes might have resigned, but her network of corruption ran deeper than anyone had realized. 2 weeks later, as Jake walked through the now complete Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center, he received a call from Detective Maria Santos. "Hayes has been arrested," she said. "Federal charges, conspiracy, fraud, abuse of public trust. The investigation you started helped break open a whole system of corruption." Jake paused in the center's main hall, surrounded by the soft sounds of families registering for programs, children playing in the supervised area, elderly residents attending a health screening clinic. "I never wanted to bring anyone down," he said. "I just wanted to help people up." Santos chuckled. "Sometimes those are the same thing. When you clean out the rot, healthy things can finally grow." That evening, Jake stood with Thomas on the center's rooftop garden, looking out over their neighborhood as the sun set behind the Chicago skyline. The old man was stronger now, more present, though he still had difficult days. "You built something beautiful," Thomas said, gesturing at the garden where community members were tending vegetables and flowers. "We built it," Jake corrected. "All of us together." Thomas smiled. "You know what I like best about it?" "What's that?" "It's not just helping people survive, it's helping them grow." Jake nodded, watching children play while their parents attended a financial literacy workshop in the building below. "That's what real safety looks like. Not just rescuing people from emergencies, but preventing the emergencies in the first place." A year later, Jake stood before the Chicago City Council one final time, not as someone defending himself against accusations, but as someone presenting a model for other cities to follow. The Bridge program had become a national example of community-centered public safety. The Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center served over 1,000 families every month. Community safety, Jake told the council, isn't about bigger budgets or more equipment. It's about bigger hearts and more connections. It's about seeing problems before they become crises, and seeing people before they become statistics. Chief Rodriguez sat in the front row, his father beside him. Thomas was wearing his old fire department dress uniform, still fitting perfectly after all these years. His eyes were bright with pride, not just for his son, but for the young man who had taught them both what service really meant. After the presentation, reporters crowded around Jake on the council steps. One asked the inevitable question, "Are you planning to run for office?" Jake smiled, shaking his head. "I'm planning to keep doing the work. Politics is about winning arguments. Community service is about winning trust. I'd rather have trust." As the crowd dispersed, Jake walked slowly back toward the community center. Evening was falling, and the building glowed with warm light from dozens of windows. People learning, healing, growing, building something together that was stronger than any one person's vision. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news coverage. You've proven that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to look away. Thank you for not looking away. A friend. Jake read it twice, then put his phone away. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more people to help, more bridges to build. There would always be those who preferred the darkness, who profited from division and despair. But tonight, Jake walked home through streets where children played safely, where elderly residents sat on front porches without fear, where young families were learning skills that would change their lives for generations. He had learned something important in his journey from rookie firefighter to community leader. Heroes weren't the people who never fell down. Heroes were the people who got back up and then reached down to help others do the same. The real fire wasn't always the one burning in buildings. Sometimes it was the one burning in hearts, the fire of hope, of dignity, of the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a chance to rise. And sometimes, Jake thought as he turned the corner toward home, the most important rescue you could make was helping someone rescue themselves. The Thomas Rodriguez Community Safety Center stood as proof that when ordinary people chose to see each other's humanity, extraordinary change became not just possible but inevitable. It stood as a reminder that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it simply showed up with a thermos of soup and asked, "Are you okay?" But most of all, it stood as testament to a simple truth. In a world that often felt like it was burning down, the real heroes were the ones who ran toward the flames, not to be celebrated, but because someone needed help, and they refused to walk away. Jake Chen had learned to fight fires of many kinds. But the most important flame he'd ever tended was the one that burned in the hearts of people who discovered they weren't alone, they weren't forgotten, and they weren't without hope. That fire, once lit, could never be extinguished. It could only spread, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one person choosing to stop and help another, until the whole world was warm with its light.